A dangerous military dog was set to be put down. He bit every handler and refused all commands. Then a blind female soldier walked into his kennel. She whispered one word in a foreign language. The vicious dog immediately sat at her feet, whimpering like a lost puppy. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor of the military K9 rehabilitation facility. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez moved through the corridor with measured steps, her white cane tapping a steady rhythm against the polished floor. The scars that mapped her face told stories she rarely shared, stories written in fire and shrapnel 3 years ago in a place that existed now only in nightmares and via appointments. "He's in the last kennel," Dr. Morrison said beside her, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. "We've tried everything, Elena. 3 different handlers, 2 behavioral specialists. He won't eat properly, won't respond to commands, and yesterday he nearly took Jenkins' hand off." Elena paused, tilting her head as the distant sound of agitated pacing reached her ears. Something stirred in her chest, a flutter of recognition she couldn't quite place. "How long has he been here?" 6 months. Found him in a Syrian refugee camp, half dead from an infected wound. No records, no handler listed. Just a microchip with a serial number that leads to classified files we can't access. Morrison's footsteps stopped. "The brass wants him put down tomorrow morning." The air grew thick with the scent of industrial disinfectant and something else, something wild and wounded. Elena's fingers tightened around her cane as they approached the final kennel. Through the chain link she could hear the soft pad of paws on concrete, restless and endless. "What's his designation?" she asked, though her throat felt suddenly dry. "K9-7743. German Shepherd, approximately 8 years old. Military trained, but we can't determine his specialization without." Elena's cane clattered to the floor. The pacing stopped. In the sudden silence, the world seemed to hold its breath. Elena's hand found the cold metal of the kennel gate, her fingers tracing the wire mesh with the desperate hope of a woman reaching across an impossible chasm. Behind the barrier, she heard the soft whine of an animal caught between recognition and disbelief. Cobble. The explosion. The ringing in her ears as concrete rained down like deadly snow. Blood in her eyes, the taste of copper and dust. And through it all, the desperate howling of, "Ghost?" she whispered. The silence shattered like glass. A massive form launched against the kennel door, not in aggression but in desperate recognition. Elena dropped to her knees as 80 pounds of German Shepherd pressed against the barrier, whimpering in a voice that carried 3 years of searching, 3 years of waiting, 3 years of refusing to forget. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed, stepping back as the dog that had been catatonic moments before came alive with frantic energy. "How did you?" Elena's hands found the latch, muscle memory guiding her fingers to the familiar mechanism. Ghost burst through the opening and into her arms with the force of a small earthquake, nearly knocking her backward as he pressed his massive head against her chest. His body trembled like a leaf in a hurricane, and she could feel the raised ridges of scars beneath his coarse fur, mirror images of her own hidden wounds. "I thought you were dead," she murmured into his neck, her voice breaking on words that had waited 3 years to be spoken. I thought I lost you too." Ghost pulled back to look at her face, his dark eyes studying the scars that hadn't been there before. His nose worked frantically, cataloging the changes, the smell of hospital soap, the lingering traces of medications, the salt of tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry in years. But beneath it all, he found what he'd been searching for, the scent of home, of the woman who had been his anchor in a world of chaos and gunfire. Elena's hands mapped his face with the desperate tenderness of the newly reunited. She found the notch in his left ear where shrapnel had grazed him in Fallujah, the thin scar above his right eye from their second deployment, the slight bend in his tail from the time he'd taken a hit meant for her in Kandahar. Each mark was a memory, a shared moment in a war that had tried to take everything from them. "You remember, don't you?" she whispered, her fingers finding the sweet spot behind his ears that had always made him lean into her touch. "You remember all of it." Ghost's tail moved in the slow, measured wag that had always been his signature, not the frantic happiness of an ordinary dog, but the controlled response of a soldier who had learned that joy was a luxury earned in moments between battles. He pressed his head against her palm and closed his eyes, the tension bleeding from his muscles like water from a broken dam. Dr. Morrison watched in stunned silence as the dog that had been marked for death transformed before his eyes. The aggression that had kept handlers at bay melted away, replaced by the calm focus of a military working dog responding to his handler. But this was more than training, this was love, pure and fierce and unbreakable. "How long were you together?" Morrison asked softly. "For years," Elena replied, never taking her hands from Ghost's head. "4 deployments. He saved my life more times than I can count." Her voice caught. "I was supposed to save his." The memories came in fragments, sharp and painful as broken glass. The IED that had torn through their patrol, the blast that had stolen her sight and scattered their unit like leaves in a hurricane. She remembered reaching for him in the chaos, her hands finding only empty air and settling dust. The medics had pulled her from the rubble, rushed her to field hospitals and then to Germany and finally home, but Ghost had simply vanished. "The records were classified," she said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "When dogs are separated from their handlers in combat, sometimes they're reassigned to Black Ops special missions. The paperwork gets buried so deep that a dog officially ceases to exist," Morrison finished. "Until he shows up half dead in a refugee camp with no identification except a microchip." Elena nodded, her throat too tight for words. She thought of Ghost spending 3 years searching for her, working with handlers who didn't understand his signals, sleeping in kennels that didn't smell like home, waiting for a voice that never came. The thought nearly broke her. Ghost seemed to sense her anguish. He pressed closer, his warm breath on her neck carrying the familiar comfort that had gotten her through countless nightmares and forward operating bases across 3 continents. His presence was a balm to wounds that had never properly healed, a missing piece of her soul clicking back into place. "Machplatz," she whispered in Dutch, their old command language chosen because so few people understood it. "Make room." Ghost immediately shifted position, moving to her left side and sitting at perfect attention, his shoulder pressed against her leg in the position that had allowed her to maintain her bearings in the chaos of combat even before her sight was taken. The movement was so automatic, so perfectly executed, that it brought tears to her eyes. They had been a team, she and this magnificent creature. Where she had been his anchor, he had been her compass, guiding her through hostile territory with an intelligence that had saved entire squads. Together, they had been something greater than the sum of their parts. A bond forged in fire and sealed with blood. "Russ," she said softly. "Rest." Ghost relaxed marginally but maintained his position, his ears still alert for threats that might never come. Even in this sterile facility, thousands of miles from any battlefield, he was still protecting her. Morrison cleared his throat gently. "Elena, I need to ask, would you consider?" "Yes," she said before he could finish. "Whatever it takes. Foster, adopt, permanent placement. I don't care what you call it. He's coming home with me. The paperwork alone will take weeks. The bureaucracy, the approvals. Then we'll wait." Elena's voice carried the steel that had made her a leader in one of the world's most dangerous professions. "We've waited 3 years. We can wait a little longer." Ghost's tail thumped once against the concrete, a sound like a heartbeat, like hope returning to a place it had been absent too long. As Elena sat on the cold floor with her arms around the dog she'd thought she'd lost forever, she felt something shift inside her chest. The hollow ache that had lived there since the explosion began to ease, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: wholeness. They were both scarred, both broken by the same war that had tried to destroy them. But they were alive and they were together, and sometimes that was enough to rebuild a world. In the harsh fluorescent light of the kennel, a blind soldier and a traumatized dog began the long journey home, carrying between them the unbreakable bond of warriors who had found their way back to each other against impossible odds. The scheduled euthanasia was quietly cancelled. Some battles, after all, are worth fighting twice.